is so good to be back with you this evening. If you will, go ahead and open with me to Luke chapter 19, please. Luke chapter 19. We're going to be starting there in just one moment. I was telling Andrew before we began, we gave our kids the choice of where they wanted to go tonight, whether they wanted to go to Nashua or here for VBS. For the whole day, my oldest was saying, well, I want to go back to my friends at Nashua. I want to go there. And about 30 minutes before I left, he says, well, actually, Dad, I want to go with you. And at that time, we'd already told his teacher, hey, you can expect our kids there. And so we were like, well, you made your decision, you have to go. But they've been really enjoying this VBS, and I bring that up just to say how wonderful it has to have been here with you this week for my family and for me. It's been a joy being able to worship with you all and study with you all. As Andrew knows, as preachers, it's hard to get out on Sundays and Wednesdays. And so it's nice to have the opportunity just to worship with fellow disciples that are so close by in the city. Tonight we're studying Zaccheus. For me, Zaccheus has always been a fascinating story, specifically because his name is Zaccheus. There we go. And as a Zach, it always, am I named after Zaccheus or am I not? And unfortunately for me, I was named after Zach Morris from Saved by the Bell, so there's no biblical connection in that whatsoever. But Zaccheus is a wonderful, wonderful story. And one of my favorite things about Zaccheus is I've read through it from a kid to an adult, and there's always something new in his message or his lesson. Specifically this time, and I'm going to cover it in just a moment, I talked a little bit about it last night. The definition and what a sycamore tree is, I think, reflects very clearly in faith, in Zaccheus' faith and in our faith. And I'm going to try and pull that out as we go through it. As I've mentioned every night, we start with the idea of being rooted in faith so we can stay on the same page. It's down there at the bottom, coming from Proverbs 12, Psalms 1 and 80, and Isaiah. I can see now I've added another verse that I obviously forgot to add on the other two. And so we're adding new things as this week goes along. Taking root is the renewal of God's blessings in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 30, Isaiah 27:6, and Isaiah 37:31. But the idea that that we've been covering and kind of staying on the same track now that I've changed it up is that being rooted in faith is all about being committed and established in faithfulness, seeing God's blessings being renewed around you. And that's what this study, I hope, has been, that as we study faithfulness and the idea of trees, it shows us God's care for his creation, not just the plants, the flora, and the fauna, but for his people. And specifically, that's what we're going to highlight this evening. Because what we see in Zaccheus is this idea that faith changes us. It takes us from selfishness and sin to service and humility. And so we have to allow faith to root in us and then produce fruits of great righteousness so that we may receive the fruit of life from God's blessings. This class, what we're going to do is we're going to start with Zaccheus. We're going to understand his role and his application, what we can learn from him. And then from there, we're going to highlight a parallel of Zaccheus to Matthew, the tax collector, in Matthew chapter 9. We're going to learn some things about that application. We're then going to kind of take what we learned from those two and apply the understanding of a universal gospel, what the gospel is meant to be, and how in Israel's times, they wanted to restrict it to what they knew as Israel, and how it opened up through Paul's apostleship as Jesus died upon the cross and opened that up for everyone. And we're going to highlight the fact that the gospel is for all, regardless of a historical background, because it's about faith. And then finally, we're going to end with two lessons of a fig tree and some more Pauline insight into how we remain tethered into the faithfulness of God's salvation. And I'll say this too, I was mentioning to Andrew, I love when Bailey is able to sit in class without the kids because she's my greatest, I want to say critic, but that sounds really harsh. She's not a critic, but she is the one where I will turn to and say, okay, how did that sound? Is there anything I could have done better? And she reminded me yesterday that, if I get to the end of every class and I'm apologizing every time for not letting you guys talk, then maybe I should be trying to fix it up and trying to shut up. So we're going to try something different this evening, where I've put questions littered into the slides so that I have to stop instead of just keep rolling on. And if it works, we'll do that again tomorrow night. If it doesn't, we'll probably go back to the other way, and I'll apologize in advance for tomorrow night. But we'll see how it goes. If you'll look with me in Luke 19, chapter 1. Again, I'll put the passages up here. They're small, so please do follow along with me in your Bibles if you can't see the words up here. But this is Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled, he has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zaccheus stood and said to the Lord, Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. You know, we can see the point of this account right there at verse 10. Jesus is striving to reach out to the lost to save them. And Zaccheus is lost. And the more we dig into this, the more we can understand this. First, in verse 1, what we see is that Jesus is entering Jericho on his way to the final entrance into Jerusalem. Later on in this chapter, we get the triumphal entry. When he's in Jerusalem, we talked about this at the beginning of the week, when he has tree branches laid across the ground as he is entering Jerusalem for the final time before his death, burial, and resurrection. He is on the way to die. Now, what's neat is that Jericho is that city that was conquered all the way back in Joshua chapter 6. And again, I say, you learn something new every single time, or you at least you start to scratch different itches. And one of the things that's always stood out to me whenever I've read this passage or other passages after Joshua chapter 6 is the idea that, Joshua cursed Jericho. Joshua said Jericho will never again rise up, and if it does, it's going to take the life of the child of who tries to build the city. And so it's always stood out to me, what happened? Why is that the case? And it's fulfilled, honestly. You look back in Joshua chapter 6:26, he curses Jericho in its ruin. The curse is fulfilled in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 34, when someone rebuilds Jericho and their son dies because of it. But from that moment on, Jericho stands as a city. And so you can see then that this is well beyond that curse. The curse has been fulfilled. And I just thought that's a neat little tidbit to tie in to see God's faithfulness to a promise, a curse made by his faithful leader at Israel's spiritual high point. And now in this city, we get another moment of faithfulness. Zaccheus, we're told very simply in his introduction there in verse 2 what he is. He is a chief tax collector. And if that's not enough to tell you more about him, he's rich. He is wealthy because of his job. Tax collectors, just for a brief history, Roman tax collectors were meant to meet Roman quotas. So Rome would establish this is how much you need to bring in from your constituents. You're going to go out and you're going to get that money from them and you're going to bring it back to the empire. Now this is different than what we might think. Today we've got, we can get on the internet and pay our taxes. As a preacher, that's the pretty simple way to pay my self-employment taxes. I get on the internet and I just say, all right, take it from me. There you go. That's different in Rome. What they would do is they'd set up these booths on street corners or in the marketplace, and they would tax you as you walked by. Now, the thing about tax collectors is that Rome wasn't very concerned if the tax collectors decided, you know what, Rome's quota is here. If I had this much to it, then I can take that home for myself. Rome actually allowed that. They were okay with that, and so tax collectors were often looked upon as these dishonest and deceitful people. And what's even worse, especially in a Jewish sense, is that these were Jews taking money from their fellow Jews for the foreign nation that, when you get to Revelation, Rome's going to come in and destroy Jerusalem. And here they are, fellow Jews who are working for their enemy, who the one that they view in all the prophetic ways are saying, well, this is the enemy that God's going to come and destroy, and here Jews are working for them. And so again, what you take with all that information, you see that Zaccheus is most likely very dishonest, very deceitful. He's not well received by his fellow people. Even if we don't take into account what the crowds say about him, based on what a tax collector was and based on the fact that he was rich, should tell us that this is not a very nice guy. Now, a chief tax collector was just the idea that they're responsible for larger regions, and so he was basically the manager, and he would have smaller employees who would work other tax booths in his area. And so he was taking advantage through all these people. So again, think about it this way, right? You've got the tax collectors in their booth. They're skimming off the top, so to speak. He is taking a percentage of what they're taking. So you can imagine that might make the tax collectors in those booths say, well, we need to take a little bit more so that Zaccheus can have what he wants. The inference here is that Zaccheus is a dishonest and deceitful person taking advantage of his fellow Jews working for the enemy. So then you can get to there in verse 7, when the crowds are grumbling. You can kind of understand that. You can understand that if you're put yourselves in the shoes of the Jews who see this one who's been deceitful and harming you financially, and all of a sudden Jesus is looking at him and saying, well, I'm going to go eat with you. well, Jesus, why? I'm not acting like him, so why can't you come to my house, right? And you can start to see the response and why it, we look, for me, I think it's easy. We can look at this and say, oh, they're having a terrible response, but it's understandable in a human sense, I would argue. Now, before we jump into that, I do want to sit there and go back to verse 3 and 4. The thing about Zaccheus is that this account, if we were just supposed to know that he was a rich tax collector and just dishonest and deceitful, it would stop there in verse 2. We wouldn't get to hear anything else, but that's not what we're meant to learn from this account. Now, in verse 3 and 4, what do we see? But Zaccheus was seeking Jesus. He was physically looking for him. He had heard about Jesus, no doubt. I mean, we are at a point where Jesus' ministry had spread all across Galilee. His reputation preceded him for the miracles he had done, for the healings he had done, all these wonderful works that were attached with Jesus. And so, undoubtedly, Zaccheus had heard of all this, and he wants to see if the man meets the legends, right? He wants to see if he matches up to what he's heard about him. And then we get that wonderful statement, he's small in stature, which we so often translate in our songs, he was a wee little man. Now, I got to say, in my head, as a kid, even to an adult, whenever I hear wee little man, I think leprechaun. And so I've always thought, that'd be really strange. He's really short. In reality, as a short guy, he was probably in the range of 5'6" to 5'8", right around there. Someone shorter than 6 feet, not easy enough to be slipping into the crowds and whatnot. And so it makes sense, and as we've got this picture up here, why he can't see over the crowd and why he wants to climb a tree to get a glimpse of Jesus. And here's where I want us to understand the sycamore tree. Sycamore trees were trees found in the lowlands of Israel. And I mentioned this last night. It's because they were easily destroyed by climate. And so if it got too cold, the sycamore trees would die. They had to be in the right place, nurtured in the right elements, in order to grow their branches, to provide shade or nesting places for birds, to bear fruit in a proverbial sense. And I think, or at least the more I studied it this week, I think that's a wonderful application for our faith. If we plant ourselves in the wrong climate, in the wrong area, we will wither up and die. We won't be fed spiritually, but we'll be fed in a place where we might think, the view here is better. It looks greener, it looks nicer. Let me plant myself here, not realizing that where we're planting is poisoning our roots. And all of a sudden we look back and our faith isn't what it's supposed to be. What the sycamore tree, I think, represents is an understanding that my faith has a place that it needs to be. It needs to be in God, planted in His nourishment and His riches of wisdom and blessing if I truly want to grow. And you see that, I think, in Zaccheus and how the rest of this plays out. Because Zaccheus, yes, he's seeking Jesus, and he's climbing a tree that is frail to bolster his frail faith. Because what we see, and I'll jump ahead and spoil it, Zaccheus is a changed man in verse 10. We don't get the conversation, as we're just about to get into. We don't get the conversation of what Jesus says to him, but Zaccheus is clearly a different person when he leaves that dinner with Jesus than when he doesn't. And his faith, I would argue, grows. It changes him. It makes him into what he is meant to be. He is the sycamore in the beginning of the story. And I would argue he turns into a cedar by the end of this passage because he is ready to act for the Lord, for the kingdom. Now, what's neat about all this in verse 5 and 6, Zaccheus is seeking Jesus. Jesus is seeking Zaccheus. He looks up and he sees him in a tree. I've got this picture. I don't know if you can notice. There's other people in the tree in this little painting. And I think we could probably assume that might have been how it was. Zaccheus probably wasn't the first one to look up in a tree and say, I want to see Jesus, this person I've thought or I've heard all about. Let me climb up and see if I can get a better vantage point. I'm sure others thought, even if Zaccheus was the first, Zaccheus has a good idea. Let's do this too. And yet Jesus knows exactly who Zaccheus is. And he looks him in the eye. There are a few passages, and this is probably one of those things where I jotted down on my phone for sermon starters or sermon things. There are a few times where Jesus makes direct eye contact with someone and says something. There's this moment right here, and the other one that stands out is Peter. When Peter denies Jesus in the courtyard, he looks across and he sees Jesus staring at him. These are moments that prick the heart, that recognize, to me it says, there's something here about faith and a relationship with Jesus that needs to be taught, that needs to be understood. And you see here, Jesus is looking to Zaccheus because he is giving Zaccheus an opportunity to bear fruit. He sees one whose roots are frail, for lack of a better term, whose roots are diseased because he's dishonest and deceitful, and he's going to go to his house to give Zaccheus a chance to change. And again, we're going to tie this into some of the parables of the fig tree and the withered tree to see exactly how this is no different than how Jesus treats anyone else. But here in a very physical and understandable way, we can apply it to our own understanding. Jesus calls out to Zaccheus, and then in verse 6, one of my favorite parts about it, Zaccheus is happy. He's excited. Now, this could have been he's excited because, oh, Jesus, this one I've heard so much about, is going to come to my house. Wow, let me just show him everything. Or this could have been, you know what? This is an opportunity to learn. We're not told. We're not able to say, oh, one or the other. But I will say, when you get to the end of this passage and you see his change, he obviously learns something, and his excitement turns into fruit. So keep that in the back of your mind. Verse 7, all the crowds grumble at this, and they grumble at this because they realize Jesus is not what they want him to be. Jesus is focusing on a sinner, right? He's focusing on someone who's lost. There's no hope for Zaccheus. Why wouldn't Jesus just give up on him and turn to someone else? They're focused on themselves. How many times do you think, we see it in the Pharisees, right? How many times do we see the Pharisees say, well, why aren't you eating with us, Jesus? Why aren't you coming and sitting with us at our table with the rabbis and the Pharisees and the religious leaders? And why are you over there with the tax collectors, as we're going to see in Matthew 9 in just a moment? When the people grumble like this, it's because they're focused on themselves. It's not about faith. It's about, look what I've done, Jesus. You come and talk to me. And really, that's the key of it. They're more worried about their works. They look at Zaccheus and only see someone by his work. He is deceitful. He is dishonest. He can't really have a relationship with Jesus because look at how his life is. And we flip to it in verse 8 through 10, and you see Jesus clearly reaches Zaccheus because he sees that Zaccheus is more than just who he was, but he sees who he can be. And this, Zaccheus, I think, is also a neat comparison. We don't have time for it, but he's a neat comparison to Paul, where Paul is this root of faith that's diseased because he's taught by the Pharisees, taught by the rabbis. He has a focal point of what faith in Jesus should look like, or faith in God should look like, and it's not Christianity. And so he goes and he's tearing people out of their homes. He's there when Stephen is martyred, and yet God reaches him and changes his course through Jesus' message to show him that his roots need to be placed somewhere else so they can grow and bear proper fruit. Now in verse 8 through 10, you see the response of Zaccheus. He promises to give back and fix his wrongs. Here's someone who knows how much enormous wealth he has, but he sits here and very clearly says, I will pay everything as much as I can. I will give half of what I have to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone, I'm going to go restore it fourfold. There's someone who is pricked to the heart with his conversation with Jesus, who says, not only am I going to meet the minimum of just giving back to what I've taken from people, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to make sure they see my sorrow, but also that I can show you my gratitude for taking your time to talk to me. It's the same kind of response that we have, I believe, when we obey the gospel. That yes, we're not saved by our works, we're saved by our faith, but our works are a way of showing our gratitude to Jesus. Say, thank you for taking me from this lost soul, this damaged and wretched being, and making me whole again. Now let me live my life to please you. And you see that here with Zaccheus. And you get there in verse 9 and 10, Jesus' response, where he says salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. In this moment, the gospel hasn't spread to the Gentiles yet, and so he's making that connection. Zaccheus still had every right to a conversation or relationship with God as any of the other Jews in that city. And so now salvation has come to this city because here is a son of Abraham who has seen Jesus, who has talked with him, and has changed, which I would argue, based on the rest of Jesus' ministry, is because of his faith in what he's seen and what he's been taught. Jesus taught Zaccheus, and it clearly affected him. His heart changed him. It made him to be a fruitful tree of faith that says, I'm going to fix what I've done wrong, not because that's going to save me, but because I know that's right in the eyes of God. And so with that, I've got some questions. And so we'll go through a couple of them. What fruit does Zaccheus bear after meeting Jesus? What might we call his fruit? Repentance, yeah. Absolutely. The very first fruit that we all bear, right, is that when we come to Jesus, we repent in order to be saved. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Belief first.
Belief, yeah.
He came to the tree to see who Jesus was, and if he was who people said he was.
Yeah.
So believe.
Yeah. That's a good way. That's the first fruit. There we go. Yeah. We could even probably back it up. He heard about Jesus, and then he wanted to see if Jesus who he was, and then he repented. Yeah, absolutely.
Kindness and goodness are also being born of this desire to be
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I have a little bit different take.
Okay.
When you read when he says, "Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor,
Mm-hmm.
and if I have taken anything from anybody by false accusation, I restore it." So if, in this case, is past tense. So I think he's been dealing fairly with
Okay.
people, and he's speaking up and defending himself.
I can understand that, yeah.
So that was,
Yeah. Well, if we go by that, then it's still the fruit he's bearing is a continual faith that defies the expectations of what the world might put on him, where he's still living separate from what they expect. Yeah.
And with his, going back to his climbing the tree, we don't really have a lot of historical accounts of adults doing this kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
What we do have are a lot of historical accounts of children having this behavior. It's very common for children to climb trees to see whatever was going on, whether it's a Roman military procession or whatever. You see children climbing trees. And I think that that's something that we're seeing out of him is a childlikeness that is born of wanting to see Jesus and have some sort of connection with Jesus, even if it's just seeing him from afar.
Mm-hmm.
I think we see that Jesus saying, one who comes like a child will be accepted, and I think we're seeing that out of Zaccheus here. So I know it's not exactly the question, but it's one fruit, childlikeness, that bears more fruit.
Yeah, and I would say that fits with the third question. How is Jesus defining salvation? Here's someone coming to him like a child, like he's told the apostles, let the little children come to me. And really, we get to it, or we will get to it in just a moment in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus tells the Pharisees, I'm not here to help those who are healthy. I'm here to help the sick. And the key to that is that we're all sick. And we have to be able to have that childlike response. It says, I need this help, instead of sitting there saying, oh, I don't need anything. But you're right. So let's move on to that third question there. And how is Jesus defining salvation here with Zaccheus?
Anyone can come, whether you're a sinner,
Mhm.
not a sinner,
Yeah.
anybody at all.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter what your community thinks of you. If you have faith, Jesus takes you. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's that's a wonderful point that he hasn't even died yet, and so he's still saying, "Here's salvation." Right? It's like just like I think it's Luke. It might be John, where he tells the robber on the cross, "You're going to be with me in heaven." It's Jesus who can tell us that kind of way.
And he also has an active response here. It's not just, Jesus, I think you're great.
Mm-hmm.
When he has this moment with him in 8, verse 8, he has an active response
Yep.
to Jesus and Jesus' teaching. Because the way the New American Standard reads, and at least in my version, is it seems as though Zacchaeus just kind of stops in the middle of the road.
Mm-hmm.
That he's hearing, that's the way it sort of indicates
Okay.
here. When they saw it, they all began grumbling, verse 7, saying, he's gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord. So the way that the New American Standard reads it is it's almost like he's in the middle of the road, and he's like, you know what? This is what Jesus has been teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so I need to respond to that. He has some sort of active response to Jesus. And so whether he's already had the meal with him or whether he knows of Jesus' teaching, either way, he has an active response to what Jesus has to say.
There's a desire to improve no matter what from that moment on in Jesus' example. Absolutely. Absolutely. Which it's a good reminder to us that our faith doesn't just stop when we obey the gospel. It continues on. It continues to grow. It continues to push in service of the King who has saved us. That's a good point. Well, let's move on to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, so I told you at the beginning, we're going to compare Matthew's calling to Zacchaeus, because I think in it you get a very similar account. So in Matthew chapter 9, again, it's going to be up here. It's a little bit small, so it starts in verse 9. We're going to read through verse 13. But Jesus he has just healed a paralytic who he's laying on his bed, and he says, your sins are forgiven, you've been healed. And the crowd says, well, he's blaspheming. And so there's the wonderful question Jesus asks him, well, what's easier for me to say, that your sins are healed or that your body is healed? And of course, the right answer to that is, well, it's easier to say your sins are healed because no one can double check that. And so he says, well, in order for you to know that I can do that, I'm going to tell him to get up and walk, and he does. And so we're right after that. And so verse 9, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. You know, Matthew here, it's very similar, just in a different way. Matthew is working, and yet Jesus sees him and invites him. He gives him the opportunity to change from what he's doing to now be a part of something better. And we see there in Matthew, it's almost the same response, just without the one little adverb. He immediately gets up and joins him. We just aren't told that he's doing it joyously. But I would kind of assume if you're immediately getting up out of your tax booth to follow Jesus, there's got to be some excitement in that. There's got to be some joy in that. And so he immediately joins this work. There's no hesitation. There's no, oh, you know what, let me make sure that this is taken care of. Because honestly, and I didn't add this earlier, tax collector booths, even though they were looked down upon, it was a way to make good money. And so if you left your booth, someone would come in pretty quickly and fill that spot. And so here he is. He's not even thinking about his future in terms of monetary sense. He says, here's Jesus. I'm going to follow him. Now, what's fascinating about this is, yes, Jesus' reputation, maybe that exact event of him healing the paralytic might have already gotten to Matthew, so maybe he's heard about it from his friends, but we don't get a moment where, we really see him talk to Matthew beforehand and say, let me tell you who I am, let me tell you the gospel, let me tell you about the kingdom. No, he just comes up to Matthew and invites him to follow him. And Matthew does it. And not only does that, from there in verse 10, he's reclining at a table in the house. Many scholars assume that this is Matthew's house where he's eating at now. And Matthew, you can see, if he's a tax collector, and now tax collectors are coming to eat with Jesus, to me that says Matthew is out there saying, okay, this is my circle, this is my social circle, come meet Jesus. Come meet the man who has called me to his work. And that's where you see the Pharisees get angry. Again, the Pharisees who sit there and complain about Jesus constantly, here they're complaining about what Jesus is doing. He's surrounding himself with sinners, with tax collectors. It's very similar to the parable where we see the Pharisee praying in the temple, where he's proud and all high and mighty, and he says, well, thank you, God, for not making me like this tax collector. They look down upon them because these works clearly define someone who is unfaithful in their eyes. And so Jesus tells them otherwise. I always, side note, I always love these little moments where they say it to the disciples and Jesus overhears it and immediately says, well, you know what, no, you're wrong right now. And it's like as a kid, I remember I thought I could always say something really quiet and mom wouldn't hear me. And I always was reminded, no, mom's got very good hearing and you're also a little louder than you think you are. Jesus, again, take the imagery of God as the Father and Jesus is God. Jesus hears his people, he knows their hearts, and he's able to say, okay, you're approaching this the wrong way. Let me try and fix that. Because that's what he's doing with the Pharisees. Even in later in Matthew chapter 23 and 24, when he pronounces the woes on the Pharisees, yes, it's harsh, yes, it's blunt, but it is a parent who is just trying to correct his people so they can see where they have gone wrong. So they can see where they can learn and grow and become faithful in him. And so here he tells the Pharisees very clearly, well, you're right. I'm here to save those who are unrighteous. If you're not sick, you don't need a doctor. So you're right. Maybe you don't need to come to Jesus. And in that, you do see the irony in this statement. All of us need Jesus. All of us are sick. All of us are diseased trees who need help for our roots. And so if we're going to ignore him, that's because our self-righteousness says, well, no, you're fine. Look at what you've done. Look at what you can do. We can sit up there and look at our accomplishments and say, well, I've been a Christian for this long. My children are faithful, and so that's good. I've gone to VBS every year that I can. I've taught classes. I'm a faithful person because look at what I'm doing. Instead of saying I'm a faithful person because look at what Jesus has done, self-righteousness takes out that need for the doctor and puts our place in his and says, well, I'm good enough because look at my righteousness. And that's what he's trying to reach with the Pharisees. And he tries to explain, I shouldn't say try, he explains his reasoning there at the end of verse 12 into verse 13, where he directs them, you go learn what this means, right? You learn what it means that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Receiving salvation is not about what I've done, it's about mercy. And therefore, if I have been saved by Jesus, I should be showing the same mercy I have received to others and not saying, well, you need to be this level of faithfulness in my eyes. I think it's easy to act that way sometimes, where we expect, maybe we're teaching a Bible class, and we expect someone who comes in off the street to know exactly what we've known. I think that's a struggle as a preacher sometimes to say, well, you know what, I've been reading this passage 7 times this week. I've got my highlighters, my annotations. I can tell you where this says in the history, all that. And so, well, shouldn't other people know this? Shouldn't other people come to Bible class and have this understanding already? Oh, well, if they don't, well, it just means they're not studying enough, when in reality, that's just life. And especially in this time where Jesus is reaching out to those who are lost, he's reaching out to a tax collector whose only friends are fellow tax collectors because of how ostracized he would have been in that society. And he's saying, here's someone who saw his need in me, and I'm here to help him. And you Pharisees, you who have the Word of God, are sitting there and closing the door for people to me. We are the sinners, like Matthew, who are in need of the physician. And we have to recognize that need. That's where faith comes in. Yes, Andrew?
But with all 3 of these, Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of Jesus calling Matthew or Levi in Mark and Luke's account, it always transitions from this moment in verse 13 to then a discussion about fasting. Why are you not fasting? Why don't you do what we're doing? And Jesus gives an explanation, but I think it comes back to this, why don't you do what I'm doing? Instead of, really the question should be, why are you doing what God wants you to do?
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. And sometimes when I have made decisions for myself to better myself, to do things more in what I think is in line with what God wants, then I start to add those onto everybody else and say, well, if you're not, as you said, if you're not doing it, then are you really trying your hardest? Are you really a faithful person? And so each one of these, it comes to this, well, why aren't you doing what we're doing? Well, they're doing what God is happy with. And that's really what matters first and foremost. If God is happy with it, then let them do what they're doing. If the Bible gives the authority to do it, let them do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go ahead and put the question up here, but I'll jump off of that point. How do we fix that mindset in our discipleship? When we put up our own hedges for kind of that term where we say this is going to help me, how do we fix that mindset of not trying to apply it to other disciples? What's the key to that? There we go. Yeah, in that sense, it's not. It doesn't matter what they're doing. If they're in a relationship with God, I should be happy for that. And one, I should be able to say, I'm going to bear their burdens. But if I'm sitting there and reading into it and saying, oh, well, they're not doing this, well, that means I need to go talk to them. Again, that's not me, right? Yes, sir.
But then sometimes people judge others' motives or intentions. We're not to be judges.
Yeah.
We can see actions and correct those
Yeah.
or rebuke it or whatever, but I try to leave judgment in God's hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Along with that, we have a good friend that said you should be a fruit inspector.
Mm.
Help people be a fruit inspector.
Yeah.
Don't be a judge,
Mm-hmm.
but look and show the fruit.
I like that. That's a good saying. I'll have to keep that in mind. It's fascinating. The Bible example of biblical authority doesn't say, okay, before something happens, you go talk to someone. It's, well, yes, you're looking out for them, you're bearing their burdens, but it's after someone happens, then you go and say, okay, we need to fix this if it's a sin. If it's something wrong, we need to work on this and lift them back up when they've fallen. It's not, I can see, you're walking a certain way that I don't like, so let me just go ahead and put this barrier in front of you so we can stop this. It's about encouraging them and showing that mercy, again, that Jesus has shown us. Oh, yes, sir.
Following Tim, if a judgment is made, it's not unusual to go with the feeling or the attitude of being condescending to others.
Yeah.
And that kind of just shuts off everything. That's
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably the I don't want to say the number one killer of zeal, but when we feel like someone is looking down on us, it stops us from wanting to be around them or even learn what they're trying to teach. Andrew?
Well, something can be wise,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily a commandment of God.
Yeah.
Especially if it's wise for you because you know yourself, but someone may not need what you need,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore, if it's not a commandment of God, it's not your place to hold
Mm-hmm.
them accountable to what is wise and helpful to you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Tim?
That's what the Pharisees were doing. They were judging Zacchaeus' motives or judging him. And like I was suggesting, he's been living a right life,
Mhm.
possibly.
Yeah.
But yet they're judging him just because maybe of others or something like that. But they preconceived something there and making that judgment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sycamores are real good climbing trees because the bark's smooth.
Okay. There's another thing you learned. I didn't realize that either. That's neat. Yes, sir.
1 Corinthians 12:14, the body is not one member of many. So
Mhm.
we all, the hearing, the eye, the hand, the foot, we all bring those things to the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In that example, I might wear gloves if I'm working with something outside in the yard, but I'm not going to put gloves over my ears to protect them from sound. It's what I use to protect myself in one thing may not be helpful for the other part of the body as it's described there. And that's going off what Andrew was saying. And, in that, again, I think we see Jesus' teaching. If Jesus had mercy on us when we were sinners, when he is able to judge us and see our hearts and say, you know what, this is wicked, and yet he looks upon us and dies for us, there's no right for us to look upon someone else and say, you know what, I'm not Jesus, but I can judge you. It's no, I'm not Jesus, so let me have mercy on you as Jesus had on me. Because that's what brings people to faith. That's what brings people to salvation. I'm going to go ahead and jump past the rest of these questions because I'm going to let you all in on something. When I first started preaching, I was known as the short-winded preacher. They would give me a time limit. I would always be about halfway through, so if it was 40 minutes, it'd be 20 minutes. And yet now I've turned into one where it's 7:46, and we're not even really halfway through my notes. So I apologize for that, but we will go ahead and go on. So this is in Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, I mentioned this earlier this week, because as we've been doing daily devotionals over at Nashua, where we're going through this year Romans and Joshua and Hebrews and tying in the idea of being firm in our faith by looking to Jesus. And so this one came across my study and what I was writing for, and it stood out, especially as I was preparing for this, of the idea of what faith looks like. And what we've already gone on, that how faith is for anyone. We talked about how our salvation came to Zaccheus because he was a son of Abraham, and here's salvation in the house. You get to Romans 11, that salvation, the gospel has been open to everyone. And so now Paul in chapter 11 is dealing with the fact or the argument, well, now what happens to Israel? Because if it's open to the Gentiles, does that mean Israel is just a failure and will never be able to be saved? And Paul is a fascinating writer because he always asks these rhetorical questions and he always answered it very emphatically. And so in verse 1, he says, they're asked then, has God rejected his people? By no means. Just because God is opening salvation to one group of people, now the whole world, it doesn't mean his Israelites have lost their chance. No, it means that they too can also obey the gospel, but now so can everyone else. And if you look there with me, I want to read verses 1 through 6, and then a few verses afterwards, but we're going to start in verses 1 through 6. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. And if you'll drop down with me to verse 17. Verse 17, this is when he now changes his point. He's talking to the Gentiles. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. You know, one of the things that Paul does wonderfully in the book, the letter to the Romans, is he ties in the fact that Israel, historical Israel, is important. It is special. It's meant to be special, but they failed in what they were meant to do. And so, yes, now the gospel's open, and here, you know, he's sitting here and telling the Gentiles, you've been saved, you've gotten this opportunity, don't you go turning around to the Jews and start mocking them because look at what you've done. That's completely wrong. And not only is it wrong, it's what the Jews were doing, right? We just got done reading about Matthew and Zaccheus, and they're looking over at the tax collectors saying, you're sinners. You don't belong here. And yet Jesus is there saying, no, they're the ones with faith. And so you see here in verses 1 through 6, again, Paul is making this argument for the Israelite people, and he's dealing with that question about how the Jewish people are meant to be seen in the light of the gospel being shared to the Gospels. Israel's not being rejected because God does not like them anymore like it was some middle school friend. No, they're being rejected because they are unfaithful and they are wicked. Israel focused on works. They focused on how they looked, how they sounded, anything that pointed back to them. And you jump back to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, this is Jesus pronouncing the woes upon the Pharisees. In verses 23 and verse 24, his specific woe is that you are tithing dill, mint, and cumin. You know, spices. You're going into someone's cupboard and saying, okay, you've got this much of a spice, you owe this much of a shekel. That's not the point of discipleship. That's not the point of being in a relationship with God, and you've missed it. The Jews had missed faith and changed it out for works. And so because of that, they were cut off from the tree. And you know, when Paul is talking here about the branches that they're put on, the branches to the tree with the root that supports you, that's the tree of life. I fully believe that's what he's trying to conjure up the image here. That he is talking about the life that comes from God because God is the tree. God is the kingdom, and if you are being put into the kingdom, you are now given life. And so he's highlighting here that the Gentiles were branched on, or were grafted on as a wild olive branch attached to the tree of life so they can be sustained. And grafting is this idea, and you guys may know this a lot better than I do. This is one as someone who just kind of tried to look it up and understand it as much as I could in a short amount of time. Grafting is the idea to take something, whether it's plant, skin, or tissue, and to take it from one source and attach it to another so that it can receive the nutrients or the life it needs to keep growing. With trees, it's about taking a branch and attaching it to a part of the branch that's been cut off or whatnot, and tying it up and bandaging it up so that the veins of the branch can attach or whatnot. Again, I'm not a forester. I can't quite tell you exactly how it works, but it's so that the nutrients can keep flowing as if it were an electrical circuit that did not have a break in the line. And you think about it, you know, when someone gets a skin graft, the skin is there to grow over the wound. And so he's saying, you Gentiles have grown over the wound. You've grown over the fact that my people from Adam through Abraham and now through before Jesus, you know, they did not believe. They had to be cut off. And yet, thank goodness, the rest of God's created people, whom he creates in his hand, can be saved and grafted on to cover the wound of those who had the prophets, who had the land, when they rejected him. That's the beauty of this image. And again, Paul is there to warn them. You know, as much as he's there to encourage them, he warns them that you don't take that life of God and become prideful like the Israelites had been. You don't sit there and say, well, now look at me, right? Now the roles are reversed. Let me go talk down to the Pharisees. No, you take that life and you appreciate it because God has given you this great blessing. Verse 22, we didn't read it, but it says, note then the kindness and the severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you. It's the same thing there. It's that judgment is still there. If my faith goes away, God's severity doesn't just all of a sudden disappear because I was faithful for a time. No, God's severity replaces the mercy that he has shown me because I lost my faith. And I think that's important to see. Yes, sir.
One aspect of grafting is that you take something foreign and you place it, and you get basically a blood supply that keeps that alive. I get the impression that it's getting its life from something else where it's kind of like we're adopted sons and daughters of God. We're adopted into the family, but we have no inheritance. So something that's foreign that gets life from something else. And maybe that's what the Pharisees and the scribes say, you don't deserve this. Look, you're getting life from what we should be getting life from. And it's their ego.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful point. That's a good addition to the idea of grafting, that it's the continual blood source that just gives them life. Absolutely. Andrew?
But earlier in verse 7 here in Romans 11, what then? What Israel is seeking is all of us here. We all are supposedly seeking the right thing, and so therefore we get the right to be grafted. And I think that those who were chosen, we were chosen because we're seeking, not because God chose before the foundation of the world that we would be selected, but that we are seeking for the right thing, just as Zaccheus clearly is.
And that goes right back to verse 5 and 6 where he says they were chosen by grace. You're seeking for mercy, not seeking to be told you've been doing the right thing. It's that God has bestowed a gift. And that's the beauty of it all. That's how Paul, we're going to talk about it just a minute if I don't run out of time. Romans chapter 4 and verse 9 through 25, he talks about Abraham being the father to all of faith because he showed faith. And his faith is what saved him. And that's the point of Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith. It's because these people trusted in God and allowed that faith to drive their actions. They weren't saved because they thought, it'd be neat if we just go over here to the Canaan land and, we'll listen to God here, but let's go do this. No, they listened to God and they trusted and completely relied on him. And that's what faith is meant to do, that as we are grafted onto the tree of life, the source of life is God's promises, an evidence of his faithfulness and his loyalty to those promises so that we can continue to bear fruit that points back to God, that says, look at what he's done and look at how he's helped me. What a blessing it is to be a part of this tree. I'm going to skip the questions again. I feel really bad. And you guys can tell Bailey, she'll be back tomorrow. You can say, well, Zach skipped the questions a lot. He did what you told him to do, and he skipped a lot of the questions. I'll fully own up to it. But Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21, verse 18 through 22, this is the account where Jesus is cursing a fig tree for unfaithfulness. So this is when he's returning to Jerusalem. This is after his triumphant entry. He is now returning to Jerusalem. So he would go into Jerusalem, he'd come out to rest and recover and go back in. It's not that he's going to a different city. He's just resting and coming back in. Matthew chapter 21, verse 18, in the morning as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you receive if you have faith. Here's kind of more of an application of what our faith looks like if we're going to be bearing fruit. If we want to be like Zaccheus and be an active disciple and say, okay, I believe in God, now what do I do to show him my gratitude for his mercy? Here's a little glimpse. And this is very similar after the transfiguration. When Jesus comes back off the mount, there's someone who's sick and needs to be healed. And this guy, he's come up to the apostles, and Jesus comes down the mountain and says, well, your apostles couldn't do anything. And Jesus chastises them because they didn't have faith. And so he's saying it very clearly here, right? He sees a fig tree and he curses it. Now, he's hungry, right? As anyone who gets hungry, and if you can't, I think of our pantry, my kids, if they can't find a snack, they get really upset and get really angry. And it's a hard thing to deal with. Here, Jesus, as the Son of God, he's using this to make a point. It's not just some tantrum. He's saying, okay, here's a way I can teach my disciples. And so he curses this fig tree, and it withers immediately. So it's a miracle. It's a sign that shows only God can do this. And you see the disciples, they ask, well, how can this happen? And Jesus turns this into a discussion on prayer. If you pray to God and you have faith in what you're praying, and you have faith in the one who's listening to that prayer, that faith will be answered. It reminds me of way back in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 2, you get Hannah's prayer. And what always stands out to me about Hannah's prayer is how it ends. So because that's not part of our topic here, I'll kind of go through it quickly. Hannah goes and she's praying in the temple because she can't have a kid. And while in her barrenness, the other wife of her husband is sitting there mocking her because she can have kids and Hannah cannot. And so she's in the temple, she's crying, and she's in such a distressed state that Eli comes and thinks she's drunk and says, well, you need to get out of here because you can't be drunk in worship. And she explains, I'm crying, I'm praying to God. After her prayer, she walks away satisfied. She hasn't had a child yet. She hasn't had any sign of being with child, and yet she walks away satisfied because she's praying in faith to the one who has the faith and the power to answer prayers. That's what prayer is meant to be. And if we are praying in faith, he says there, this is the time of miracles. You could say to this mountain, it'll jump in the water. I fully believe that his apostles, if they had that faith, they could have said that, and the mountain would have gotten the water. But for us, this is just a reminder that we aren't praying, sometimes it feels like we're praying in an empty room. where it's quiet, it's dark, we're by ourselves, and it just feels kind of words into the void. That's not what prayer is. Prayer is a way to relieve the burdens on our heart. It's, for lack of a better idea, it's therapy with God, where God knows our hearts and our struggles, but it's us putting our trust in Him and saying, God, I know you can do this. I need your strength. Andrew, were you going to say something?
We've been talking a lot about fruit over, you talked about it Sunday night, and we've talked about it a lot the last 2 nights, and even tonight about the fruit that we bear. And that's what I find interesting about this fig tree. The fig tree is one of the only fruiting plants that it fruits and then the leaves come. And so when he sees leaves, he's expecting there to be figs, because the figs come first and then the leaves. And so in this way, this is a warning for them that you can look like you have produced fruit, but you haven't. And so again, as you said, he's using this as a spiritual lesson. I think that this is an important spiritual lesson for us. You can appear to have faith, you can appear to be a righteous person, but if you're not bearing fruit, you're not good for anything. It's no different than if you just withered and died, because you're not helping it. I think that that's another good point on top of what you said.
Yeah.
That goes along with kind of the whole week.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful one. It ties in, you think of Revelation, the lukewarm church. It's that idea, well, you're no good, right? I'll spit you out. And that goes, we're going to jump ahead real quick to Jesus' parables about a fig tree, because he continues to use the fig tree analogy in what he teaches disciples. This here, let me make sure I get the right passage. So this one is Luke 13, verses 6 through 9. We're about to read this one, and then one from Luke chapter 21 and verse 29 through 33. But here in Luke 13, he says, "And he told this parable, a man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the vine dresser, look, for 3 years now I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down, why should it use up the ground? And he answered him, Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and put on manure. And then if it should bear fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." It's that same idea. Here's the master of the vineyard, which we should understand as God coming to check on his creation. And he sees a tree, like Andrew was saying, a fig tree that wasn't bearing fruit. And it's not only that it wasn't bearing fruit that season, it hadn't been bearing fruit for 3 years. And the master says, well, it's wasteful. It's useless in here. Cut it down so we can plant something else so that it will grow and be of use to me, right? And so it's that idea. Our faith, we can sit there, like Andrew was saying, and we can look as faithful as we want. We can come to church every Sunday, every Wednesday for years. And our faith can still be rotten on the inside, because sometimes we sit and say, well, this is what I've taught. I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in the church, and so our rule was but my parents' rule for us as kids was we were going to church every Sunday and every Wednesday. That was a non-negotiable. And so when I got into high school and I started playing sports or I had a job, my parents would always remind me, okay, that's great, you can do that, but you will be at church Sunday and Wednesday. And I remember, when I was in high school, that was a problem sometimes, where I would grumble and say, well, I'd much rather go out and be with my buddies on the practice field, or I'd much rather go out and make money. Like that's more useful to me. And in that, it's the diseased faith that says, okay, yeah, church is neat for singing songs and reading a Bible, but for things that might really matter to me, I could be doing something else. And that's what happens when we don't make it, let me rephrase it. That's what happens when we don't make it personal to us. When it's not about my faith, but it's, this is what my parents taught me, or this is what my community does. It doesn't really matter then, because it's not personal. But when we make it personal, we become the fruit-bearing tree. And I love the way that the vine dresser talks, because I do believe the vine dresser is meant to be Jesus, where he's going to nurture the creation, right? Jesus comes and ministers, he gives the gospel of salvation to kind of push on his people, the Pharisees, the Jews. And he says, let me give it the manure. Let me dig around it. Let me do what I can to make sure it has everything it needs to bear fruit. What does Jesus do for us? He died upon the cross. He rose from the dead. He has done everything in his power to show us the path and the door to heaven. What we do with that is now our problem. And sometimes we're at the end of it, where the next year comes and we haven't borne fruit and judgment falls upon us. And so you get this parable, and this is a parable one about God's patience, where God is patient with his people, but there is an end for that patience. And so for our own discipleship, we need to be checking our roots constantly. Are we diseased? Are we just fruit or trees that have no fruit but look okay? Or are we actually working to grow? And then in Luke chapter 21, we've already read this earlier in this week, so we'll just kind of go through it quickly. And he told them a parable, look at a fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus is saying the fig trees point to what's coming. Disciples, when you bear fruit, point to the kingdom. You point to the return of Jesus. You point to the one who has saved you upon the cross. It's always neat, when sometimes it can be confusing when we read the passages like there in verse 32 where he's saying, this generation will not pass away. In this moment, he's specifically talking, this generation will see me die upon the cross and be raised. At least that's how I take it. This generation, his apostles are going to be witnesses to this account so that they can continue teaching the gospel. And then their duty is to spread the word, to teach people about Jesus, to teach people about the one who died upon the cross for their sins so that they may be saved as they are. I hope that makes sense. Yes, sir.
Teach others about Christ and about his sacrifice and obey the gospel. We need to make sure that we cover cost of discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Not that things like attending
Yeah.
saints assemble, but comes down to a simple statement, which is I obey the gospel, and that settles it. Everything else that is in the Bible should come naturally from me if I've counted the cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's the commitment. Bearing a cross, you see it in the account of Jesus. It's not an easy thing. It's heavy, it's painful. And discipleship, as great as the blessing is, discipleship on this earth is filled with trials and temptations. It's going to be difficult. And so commitment is necessary. And like you said, it's more than just saying, okay, I'm going to be at church when the assembly is there. It's every day I'm going to bear my cross for Jesus.
Jesus said it, that settles it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're going to finish up now with the faith of Abraham. This is in Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4, specifically the whole passage is from verse 9 through 25, but right here I've got verse 11 through about verse 16 through verse 25, so the last 9 verses. And so what it says is this: that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. I'll go ahead and pause there, but we started off with Zaccheus. Zaccheus had the law. Zaccheus was a Jew, and yet he wasn't saved because he was a Jew. He was saved because he had faith. And that's the point Paul makes, that faith is what saves us from sin and destruction. Faith is what bears our fruit in the image of God. And Paul goes on to give the example of Abraham, where he has faith that God will bless him with a son so that the promises can be fulfilled. Hebrews goes through this where he says Abraham had faith that even if he killed Isaac, God would bring him back. Faith is and will always be the key to having that intimate relationship with God. And we started off with Zaccheus because Zaccheus showed that faith. Zaccheus had faith to say, I'm going to climb in this tree to see Jesus. Zaccheus had faith to say, okay, now I'm going to continue to act in a way that is faithful, or I'm going to change my ways and be faithful. Faith is and will always be the key. And if we want to bear fruit, we cannot miss that understanding. Because like Andrew's pointed out, like we've seen in Jesus' examples, we can sit here and call ourselves Christians all we want. But words are just words. It has to be, as we mentioned, if Jesus said it, we are committed to doing it so that our fruit can shine back to the tree of life. Otherwise, we're that wild foreign branch that's been grafted on that will lose its place for a tree that will bear fruit, for a branch that will bear fruit. I've got 2 minutes. I do have questions, but I'm going to actually go ahead. This is just a little kind of summation of everything we talked about this evening. And so you've got, I can send this to Andrew if anybody wants it to have it printed off for themselves. So you've got Luke 19, and you've got the passages on one side, what the theme is, and the application that we can make for our own discipleship. I thought it might be easy. We've covered a lot tonight, and tomorrow, I'll go ahead and be kind of a spoiler. We will cover a lot tomorrow because my goal with that is to kind of highlight moments of faith throughout Jesus' lineage. And so I'll try to have one of these for this. I don't know if it's on the PowerPoint, so I might send you a revision. But you can see here the application we can make. We respond to Jesus with a life change. We don't delay in bearing fruit. We're always ready because there's a deadline to the fruit. Judgment day will come. We bear real fruit, not an empty show of just leaves that say, okay, he or she goes to church. We stay humble in our fruitfulness. We recognize the gift of mercy and faith over just ritual worship. We recognize that God's call comes to anyone, the unworthy. And what does Paul say? He counts all that he's done before as rubbish, essentially saying it's unworthy because Jesus has come and had mercy upon me. And then, like Abraham, we live by a faith that will bear fruit. Just kind of the same ideas that we've been going through. With that, are there any comments or questions, Mr. Tim?
Well, I think this is a good example that we speak with grace,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not to say that grace is not conditional.
Yeah.
These are conditions right here
Mm-hmm.
to receive that gift. The thing that we don't deserve, we have to do something for.
Yeah, absolutely. The grace is a gift, but that doesn't negate my need to answer the call.
There's no example of God shoving a gift down somebody's throat.
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. And tomorrow we'll finish up with Jesus' genealogy.
Glory to the King of Kings.